I'm Dr. Matt Harris, and you're listening to Gospel Tangents.
Best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I am so excited to have Matt Harris back on the show. He's the author of Second Class Saints. It's already been sold out 10,000 copies in just about a month. And guess what? I'm going to be giving away a free copy. Go to gospeltangents.com/contest, and you could win an autographed copy of this book. You know, it's been sold out. I think it might be back in already. And it's an amazing, amazing book. So we're going to talk about it. We'll also hit some old topics like Ezra Taft Benson. You know, Matt wrote a couple books on that. And anyway, we're just going to hit so many topics here. This is one of my favorite conversations, and Matt's one of my favorite guests of all time. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I have one of my absolute favorite guests on the show, and it's been way too long. It's been more than 3 years since he's been on. Could you go ahead and tell us who you are and where you teach?
My name is Matt Harris, and I teach at Colorado State University-Pueblo, where I've taught since 2005. And I teach legal history, civil rights history, race and politics, church and state, and the American Constitution.
Oh, wow. All
the stuff that I write about is usually shows up in some form in my classroom lectures and teachings. So a lot of fun.
Well, and you've got a best-selling book. In fact, yeah, I think it's only been out a month or two.
Been out since July 1.
Okay. So less than a month, and it's already sold out.
Already sold out.
So tell us the name of the book.
So the book is called Second Class Saints, Black Mormons and the Struggle for Racial Equality. And I'm happy to say it's sold out, the first print run, but there's a second printing that'll come out probably in a few days.
Okay.
So the gap is not big. So,
okay. Well,
anyway,
I just want to point out that Matt was kind enough to autograph a copy of Second Class Saints, and one of you is going to win this book. So it's a fantastic book. I'm sure. Well, here's the thing. I already think it's going to win the Best Book Award for next year, although you are going to have a run for your money because Paul Reed is coming out with his book on the 1852 legislature, similar topic, and so he might give you a run for your money. But this book is incredible.
Thank you.
So anyway, for those of you, you know, nobody watches all my podcasts like I do. We have already talked about a lot of this book from about 6 years ago, I think it was.
Probably.
And so we're going to dive into a little bit because I'm sure in the last 6 years I've got some new listeners that haven't heard that. But I will say, go check it out. But we're going to talk about some of the other stuff in this book that doesn't get as much play. And I don't know if I should ask you now. I'll ask you later, but I'll just preview it here. I'm going to ask what you had to put on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, I've been asked that. That's a good question.
Yeah. So anyway, just for those of you, by the way, you're my first 5-time guest, by the way. But it's been 3 years.
Wow. Oh my goodness. 5 times. Where does time go?
Although one of them, technically, we started talking about this book, and then I asked a question about Ezra Taft Benson, and then we went for another 2 hours. So I actually split that one up twice. So anyway, so you're a big Benson fan, right?
No. I mean, that's not a comment. Personally, it's a comment on his politics. I do not think that right-wing extremism is good for anybody. But anyway, I have written about Elder Benson, and I've written about how his political views have influenced the church. And one of the points I frequently noted to people when I've talked about Elder Benson is
because you've written 2 books on him.
Written 2 books about him. One's called Thunder from the Right. It's a collection of essays that I put together.
Fantastic book.
Thanks. And BYU professors contributed some essays, and a host of other Mormon studies scholars. And the other book is called Watchman on the Tower, Ezra Duff Benson and the Making of the Mormon Right. And what I've shared with people is he wasn't just an important religious leader, which he was, but also a significant political thinker in post-war America. And because he had such ultra-conservative views, he influenced the church, and we're still feeling his influence today. And it's not lost on me that a lot of folks who identify as, being ultra-conservative, Elder Ben and Cleon Skousen are their two favorite people. So their influence still looms large.
Very good. And that's another fantastic book I'll add.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I can't seem to shy away from controversial topics. What is it about me? Right-wing extremism and the priesthood ban and race and, so.
All right. So before we dive into the book, one thing I want to do is just, since it's been so long, just remind people where you got your bachelor's, master's, PhD, and that sort of stuff.
Sure. So I graduated in 1994 from BYU with a bachelor's degree in history and political science, mostly focused on political theory and philosophy, and did a master's degree at BYU. My wife had 1 year left at BYU, and so rather than go somewhere else for graduate school, I decided to stick around with my master's while she finished her BA. And then I went to the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs in Syracuse, New York, Syracuse University.
Oh, I thought it was Neil A. Maxwell.
Well, I don't know if they would have given me a degree. And
they gave you one already.
Yeah, two degrees from BYU.
That's right.
So then I got a second master's degree at Syracuse and my PhD. And my focus for the first part of my career was in early American history. And I've shared this before with folks, but when I was at BYU, I had several faculty mentors who told me, don't do Mormon history. It's like quicksand. Once you're in, you'll never get out.
And they were right.
And they were absolutely right. And so I don't know if my wife's very happy about that. You should have listened to your mentors. So about 12 or 13 years ago, I made a switch to Mormon history and religious history.
Of which we are very grateful.
And thank you. I really enjoyed early America. I still do. I teach it, and I still publish in the field. But mostly my energies and efforts have turned to Mormon history, where, it's. Let me say one thing that's, I think, fascinating. Sometimes people ask me, why Mormon history? And one is it's my heritage, so there's that. But the other one is from a practical standpoint. I have a colleague who teaches Roman history.
Oh.
And frequently she has to go to Rome to get source material.
There's not worse places to go.
No, there's not, but it's really, really difficult, especially during COVID, especially gathering grant funds to go. It's expensive to fly to Rome.
Mm-hmm.
For me, Latter-day Saints will send me stuff by email attachment. I can get my sources right there in my home office in my pajamas. And I live in Colorado, and the archive, most of the most important archives, as you know, Rick, are in Utah.
Right.
So the Church History Library or the Church Archives, University of Utah, BYU, Utah State, the Utah Historical Society. And then there's a few other scattered Mormon archives around the country that are important. One at Yale, one at the Huntington Library in Pasadena, California. So I get access to sources easy. And even with early America, I had to go back east to get into the archives in Philadelphia and New York and other places. So it's really an embarrassment of riches, especially when people send you things. But when I come to Utah, I'm able to crisscross these different archives and take my phone out and just start snapping pictures. It's so easy in the digital age.
So let me ask you this, because I remember, I guess it's been 1 or 2 years ago, John Whitmer Association was in Texas, and you took off to go to the Lyndon Johnson Library. Was that Mormon related or not?
No, not so much. A tiny bit. So it was mostly because I had never been before. And so Lyndon Johnson
is really interesting for Latter-day Saints. Your listeners may not know this, but we tend to think that the church has always been conservative. But in the 1960s, Utahns supported the Great Society. This is probably the one or two most liberal government programs in the history of this country.
Yeah, and Lyndon Johnson was the last Democrat Utah voted for.
That's correct. And Lyndon Johnson, believe it or not, was a good friend to David O. McKay.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, and that's really hard to hear or understand, rather, because President McKay was a pretty intense conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And when let's see, let me get this right, in 1952, when Eisenhower won election for the first time in the presidential campaign, David O. McKay wrote a friend, and he said, jokingly, with Ike's election, we know there really is a God. And I mean, I laughed when I read that, because that just shows you that President McKay wanted a Republican to win office, and just thought, divine favor at work here.
Well, this is after the almost felt like 2 decades of FDR, right?
Well, exactly right. This would have been after 13 years or 4 terms in office. Yeah. So FDR took office the oath of office in, let's see, January of 1933, about the same time Adolf Hitler's coming to power in Germany. And he died in office of April of 45, his 4th term. So if you do the math, 13 years. And so between the New Deal and the Great Society, those are the 2 of the most liberal government programs in the history of our country. And so McKay, being the conservative that he was, like a lot of conservatives, did not like FDR. But Utahns supported FDR in the New Deal, as they did LBJ, to the detriment of some church leaders who tried to counsel Latter-day Saints not to support these 2 liberal presidents. But the Saints have a mind of their own. They don't always march in lockstep with the politics of their leaders. And so they voted against the counsel from David O. McKay, from Heber J. Grant, from George Albert Smith. And, so it wasn't until the early 70s where you start to see this electoral shift with Latter-day Saints. And there's a lot of reasons for it that I talk about in my book, Watchmen on the Tower. But the civil rights movement would be one, and the welfare state, this idea where the welfare state gets a bad name, right? And so the church is really concerned that the saints would be dependent upon these welfare programs, and they ought to look to the church's welfare program as a substitute for the government program. And that didn't change until the 1980s, the mid-80s, when Gordon Hinckley was a counselor in the first presidency. Hinckley gave this remarkable sermon, and he said that it's okay to take government assistance if you've exhausted the opportunities from your family or maybe a church or a charity. But Hinckley recognized the church had limitations about what it could give towards Latter-day Saints in need. And so as a last resort, he said it's okay to take a government, assistance. And I wish I were a fly on the wall when Benson read that sermon or heard the sermon, because this would have been 85. He was still lucid at that point.
Right.
And I'm certain he had heartburn because he spent, steam coming out his ears. He spent, much of his adult life telling the saints, don't ever accept government assistance.
Right.
In 1977, he gave a talk at devotional address at BYU, and he told these young students, many of whom were married and had children, he said, you should drop out of school before you accept 1 penny from the government. And because a lot of students in the 1970s at BYU, they were taking government assistance,
right?
Which is a great irony, right? You've got this collision course going on, which is on the one hand, the counsel to these young couples is multiply and replenish the earth as soon as you get married. There's never any consideration about, whether you can afford it, do you have insurance? Just get married, have children, let it come naturally, and God will provide. Well, God is providing the taxpayers of Utah. And so that was a problem with the brethren, because that was the counsel, have children, don't delay. But on the other hand, don't take government assistance. Well, what are you supposed to do if you're a young couple at BYU and you have 2 children and you're both in school full time?
Yeah.
You're not making it. Your little minimum wage job at, making hamburgers at Burger King is not going to cut it.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would take government assistance, and Benson didn't like it, told him to drop out. I don't know how many listened to him, but that's what he said. And I don't think that some of the other brethren would have supported that.
Yeah.
I mean, Hinckley certainly wouldn't have. Probably President Kimball not either. He was not. Kimball was moderate in his politics.
Yeah.
And very few of the brethren, a lot of them were conservative politically, let's be clear, and certainly theologically. But very few of the brethren had Elder Benson's radical views of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And that oftentimes caused issues in the Quorum of the 12 and with the First Presidency, because when he would express his hard right political views in public to the saints, usually at state conferences, when they want to be spiritually edified and uplifted, they're hearing about how Lyndon Johnson's the Antichrist. They don't want to hear that. And so they complain to the First Presidency, and the First Presidency they tell Elder Benson, stop it. We're getting so many complaints about you. Stop it. Just focus on the scriptures and Jesus Christ and him crucified. Leave the politics alone to other people. But Elder Benson, it was in his DNA. It was really hard.
Yeah.
So
very good.
Anyway.
Well, cool. I will tell you one other little semi-personal anecdote. So my grandfather was a potato farmer from Idaho, and he was not a fan of Secretary Benson's agriculture policies. So can you just, I don't want to spend a lot of time on Elder Benson, but can you just dive into a little bit of his policies as agriculture secretary under Eisenhower?
Yeah. So one of the reasons why President Eisenhower called him into that position was, first of all, he was recommended by Arthur Watkins, the senator of Utah. And he was also recommended by Senator Robert Taft from Ohio, who was a very influential senator, more so than Watkins was, and also a distant cousin to Ezra Taft.
Oh, I was going to say.
Even though Robert Taft was not LDS. And so they told both Watkins and Taft told Ike, who didn't know Benson, they said, we've got the guy for you. His name is Ezra Taft Benson. He's been in farm cooperatives for a number of years. He's well respected in that line of work. And he'll do what you need to do to please party conservatives, which is to roll back the government programs or subsidies to farmers that Franklin Roosevelt had put in place.
Which is why my grandpa didn't like him.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, if you're a Democrat. So what they thought was the government, and starting with FDR and then Truman and then just going forward, the idea was that farmers, needed some assistance against the whims of Mother Nature. If there's a bad crop year, it would wipe out a farmer's crop and they would be in trouble. And we would all pay a huge price, since a lot of our food obviously comes from these farms. And so the government wanted to stabilize the market that way by helping these farmers. And Elder Benson, who starts with the premise that the government is not good, the government should not be in our lives, the government should not be given subsidies.
Why do we keep putting these people in government?
Well, so that's what Ike did. And so Benson did what Ike wanted him to do. He started to cut back farm subsidies. And millions of people complained, including Latter-day Saints in Utah. They would write, there's a letter that I read I'll never forget this letter. It's from a woman in Logan, Utah. And she wrote Ezra Taft Benson's mentor, J. Reuben Clark of the First Presidency. And she said, "Dear President Clark, Elder Benson is threatening to cut our subsidies. I want you to know how this will impact my family. I am having a faith crisis over this. Can you please direct me?" So Clark is caught in a really interesting position. On the one hand, he's sympathetic to this woman's issues, right? If they lose this government subsidy check, it's going to affect their domestic economy. They won't be able to pay their mortgage and maybe even put food on the table for their kids. But on the other hand, Clark doesn't want to meddle in what he wants to distance himself from Benson, because Benson's a lightning rod of criticism. And even the church brethren are like, oh, he is one of us. But, what he does in Washington is separate from what he does in Salt Lake as an apostle. So they're trying to make this bifurcation that's really difficult to do, because this woman who's a farmer's wife, she couldn't make that distinction. She saw an apostle and a secretary wrapped into one, but the brethren are trying to separate the two. And so he basically punted. Clark said, "You'll have to take this up with Secretary Benson," which is probably the right thing to say, honestly. But so if your own people are really frustrated with you, then that's a problem. And the thing that the woman said was, "I'm having a crisis of faith." And so that's another problem, right? She's looking at it through the lens of Mormonism and can't reconcile his foreign policies, or can't separate the foreign policies from his duties as an apostle. So anyway, he was really controversial. And I'll just say one last thing about this. And in 1956, when Ike was up for re-election, David O. McKay flew to Washington, and he said to President Eisenhower, "It's okay to release him. We'll take him off your hands." And I know that sounds grating and harsh, but what he was saying was, we know he's controversial. You don't have to feel any loyalty towards him. He needs to come home. And Ike, to his credit, said, "No, I'm going to keep him." And so he kept him for a second term. And Ike got reelected, obviously, but people told him, even Republicans, "You got to drop Secretary Benson. He's dragging you down. He's hurting the ticket," all of that. And in 1959, when Nixon was going to succeed Dwight Eisenhower in that presidential election year, Ike had been termed out. Benson had just thought about running in 60 himself and couldn't get the support from the church leaders and others. But Nixon told Ike, "Get him out of the country. I don't want to be anywhere near him because of his foreign policies." And so Ike sent him to Europe towards the latter part of the second term. That was not by accident.
That's not the first time he got sent to Europe.
No, he's been sent before, but that was for church-related issues.
I know.
This is just because of his foreign policy. Let me say just one last quick thing about Benson is that, I would never defend his politics. I don't think they're good for the church. They're good for the country. Those are just my political views and values. But one thing about Benson that he did get a bad rap for is that he really took a lot of criticism for his foreign policies. And he was only doing what Eisenhower wanted him to do. But Eisenhower left him out to dry, did not come and say, "Hey, I support him 110%. Ike distanced himself when all the arrows came. Now, you can argue that Ike supported him by retaining him for a second term, which is true. But boy, when the brickbats came flying Benson's way, Ike was hiding. And it was ugly that they threw eggs at him at public events. One farmer threw a shoe at him. I mean, when you feel like your paycheck's going to be cut in half, this hits home.
Yeah.
So Benson, this proud Mormon apostle, was hung out to dry, and Ike didn't come to his aid. And then later on in the 1960s, Benson, who was just furious with his boss, linked Eisenhower with the commies, turned on his boss. And I've been asked this before, how could he turn on his boss like this and associate his boss with, the Kremlin and comment that Eisenhower was a tool of the communists and his cabinet? It's because Benson was bitter about how Ike had treated him over the foreign policy. We could talk about this all day.
All right. So I will just point you guys to our interview about Elder Benson from 5 years ago or however long it was. It's really good. Yeah. And we dive into a lot more details. I could ask another question, but we're going to go into this book here. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Dr. Matt Harris. If you haven't got your copy, make sure you sign up to gospeltangents.com/contest and you could win an autographed copy from Matt. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about 19th century history with blacks in the priesthood.
And there was one subject in there that came back to bite the church, and the subject was Elijah Abel.
Yes.
And so this is the first time that the saints are reading that there was an early black priesthood holder. And let me tell you, they wrote letters to the First Presidency, to the Quorum of the 12. How could there be a band with Joseph Smith and Elijah Abel? And Joseph Fielding Smith said, who was then the church historian, Joseph Fielding Smith said that question has come back to haunt us. I wish he never would have included, Jensen, wouldn't have included Elijah Abel in the biography. So they didn't know how to answer it. How can you say the band began with the founding prophet, if a black man's ordained to the priesthood?
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.